Hey everyone, happy Tuesday. If you remember yesterday or you watched the video yesterday, what we're doing is we're going through the last days, the last week of Jesus' life here on earth. And yesterday we talked about Palm Sunday and Monday, and of course today being Tuesday, we're going to talk about Tuesday. But if you remember yesterday morning, Jesus cursed the fig tree because it had leaves, but it didn't have any figs. Well, the Passover fell in late March or early April, and fig trees usually didn't have fruit on them until late May or early June. But Jesus approached the tree, thought that this fig tree must have figs because it had leaves. Typically, the fruit blooms came before the leaves, so this tree ought to have had figs on it. Well, it didn't, and so Jesus cursed it. And the miracle part about it is when Jesus cursed the tree, overnight the tree had withered away almost. Normally, if you know anything about trees or plants, it takes maybe a few days or weeks to even for something to dry up the way that this fig tree had. But that was the miracle part of it, is that it had withered overnight, and the disciples took notice of this very quickly. Peter actually is the one that spoke first. But Jesus didn't offer much interpretation about what happened to the fig tree, other than he talks about the importance of faith, the power of faith. And then he gives us kind of an admonition to forgive others. So a strange miracle, but an important one nonetheless. But as they leave the fig tree scene Tuesday, they're going back to Jerusalem, back into the temple. He entered the temple courts, and what we're going to have now is what most people have called is a day of questions. It was one of the busiest, hardest, most significant days, I believe, in Jesus' entire life here on earth. It was a day of rejection, a day of questions, a day of conflict, a day of teaching. And no doubt at the end of this day, Jesus probably sat down and went, woo, at the end of a day, a long, hard day, you just give out. You're just like, man, I'm glad this day is over. You would think that Jesus, after all that we're going to see of what he went through on this day, this challenging day, he would have had that type of kind of attitude about him. And nonetheless, the adversaries, the enemies that he is talking with this whole day, they probably had the same reaction, but probably from a sense of embarrassment because they were challenged so much by Jesus, something they weren't expecting. So the first group, the Pharisees, they come to Jesus and they want to know. All of this starts out with an idea of authority. They wanted to know by what authority Jesus was doing all of these things, thinking that he had done, what he had done the last couple of days. They're thinking, what authority do you have to do such things? And really was a legitimate question, because if you're a rabbi or if you're not a rabbi, they want to know, whose authority do you have to be making or such proclamations and giving such teachings? Well, they're not really asking Jesus in the sense of wanting to discover new truths. They're only trying to expose him to the crowds. And so Jesus, being Jesus, responds to their question by asking them a question. And it was concerning the authority of John's baptism. Okay? So Jesus really, with that question, caught them off guard. And they found themselves really in a dilemma. Okay? They were silenced for a moment. And so Jesus used this moment to teach the crowds in what Mark would call them as parables. He talks about the two sons. He talks about the wicked tenant, and then he talks about the marriage feast that the king has for his son. Now, what these parables were doing was they were exposing the sinfulness of the religious leaders and maybe some of the people that were there in the crowd. So imagine you're face to face with your enemies. You've got all these different enemies, and one walks up and they start going at it, and you get this verbal combat back and forth, and you finally get him defeated or get that one defeated, and then another steps forward. So this is, again, what Jesus is facing on this Tuesday over and over again. The first group were the Pharisees and the Herodians, and now come the Sadducees, and they're going to start questioning Jesus about the resurrection. Now, what's interesting about the Sadducees is they're questioning Jesus about the resurrection because they didn't believe in a resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in spiritual life or spiritual things. And so they thought they had a question that really no one could answer about the resurrection, about life after death. But they didn't realize who they were asking. So Jesus indirectly answers their question by getting to the root of their problem. They didn't believe that the dead were still alive. And so Jesus proved that premise or that idea to be false. Then come the Pharisees again. They just won't give up. They weren't ready to admit defeat yet. So the Sadducees have walked away. They've realized that, this guy, there's something about this guy. And here's the Pharisees. They're back at it again. Matthew 22, chapter 34 says that when they had heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. So they're thinking, all right, so he's defeated them. He's answered their question. What can we do to bring this guy down? What can we do to trap this guy, this man called Jesus? And so they thought, well, let's bring out the big guns, okay? Let's bring out a lawyer, a scribe. And so they thought by bringing this lawyer to the table, he's going to be able to introduce something to Jesus that's going to maybe expose Jesus or trick Jesus. Well, he was one that knew the scriptures very well. And so he comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, what's the most important commandment of all? So think about it. There are 613 commands. Which one is the most important? And you probably know the answer to this, what Jesus says. He says, well, the most important is obvious, that you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And he said, in fact, the second is like it, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, on these two commandments, you can hang all the law and all the prophets. In other words, it doesn't matter how many commands you've got. It all is based on those two, loving God and loving other people. And the lawyer actually responded, probably in a way the Pharisees weren't expecting, but with a little bit of openness, with a little bit of honesty, which again was unlike most Pharisees. So as Jesus and his enemies are engaged in this verbal combat again, the crowd just kept growing larger and larger. It's like the more verbal combat, the larger the crowd got. And before he had ended the encounter, Jesus had one more thing that he wanted to accomplish. And he spoke to the Pharisees about their hypocrisy. Jesus is really open. He's really honest. He really just kind of, when you read this section of Scripture, it's like he lays it all out on the table. He's calling them out in front of all of these people. And he pronounces judgment on them through the woes. Remember? Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Over and over again, Jesus pronounces judgment upon them. And so as Tuesday is beginning to come to a close, Christ is on the verge of leaving the temple forever. He went into the court of women where everyone was putting in their money and their offering or their giving, into the money chest. And it's there that Jesus saw a widow. You remember what she put in, don't you? Her 2 small copper coins. And he commended her to his disciples. I've always wondered why this scene is put there, why this scene was included in the gospel accounts. But when you think about it, it makes sense. So you've got all these religious leaders, these Pharisees, Herodians, the Sadducees, the lawyers, all these different leaders that are trying to trick Jesus because they hated Jesus. Because he was trying to uproot everything that they had been teaching for so many years. So you've got this group of people that absolutely hated Jesus, determined to destroy Jesus. And in comes this poor widow woman who loves God with all of her heart, with all of her soul, with all of her mind, and all of her strength. And she literally gives God all that she has. There's a lesson there. And Jesus gives his disciples a teaching then after this on the destruction of Jerusalem. This, of course, was prompted by the disciples' question when Jesus was talking about his return, about his second coming. When is this going to happen? What are the signs of your coming? And I think one of the most important lessons for us to take away is what Jesus was telling his disciples about the second coming, about Jesus coming again, is until that time that we need to be faithful to God. Until that time, we need to be watchful in his return. And until that time, we need to always be prepared. So again, the question is, are you faithful to God? Do you love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Do you love your neighbor as yourself? Are you watchful for his return? And are you prepared?